Great to have your company. What a show tonight. Big. The news around appalling evidence, for instance, how Woolworths is ripping off customers shopping for food. Is that why it's announced it's banning Australia Day, to create a fuss that will distract you and get the Prime Minister on its side? And the most expensive immigrant we ever let in. We do the sums. They'll shock you. And the Prime Minister considers to break a promise on tax cuts as he panics about the cost of living. And also Donald Trump takes a huge step closer to becoming president again. Meanwhile, Prince Harry humiliates himself by accepting a worthless prize and posting with a fake prince and another grifter. But first, our Cricket Australia. It's just the latest organisation to give in to the Hate Australia crowd. And this whole wave of hatred is, and I'm not kidding, becoming a national security threat. Now, Cricket Australia won't acknowledge Australia Day on Friday, the second test against the West Indies. But it will start the test the day before with yet another welcome to country ceremony to welcome us to our own country. But I have to say, that is a con. How welcome are we really if we can't then celebrate Australia Day? How welcome are we if we can't also celebrate how immigrants like the British, the Irish, the Italians, the Greeks brought the democracy, the science, the medicine, the technology that's made this Australia so rich and free and safe? I think Cricket Australia is caught in an elitist bubble. Once again, it's not reading the mood of the fans. Last year, you'll remember, it backed Labor's voice, when 60% of Australians, 60% of its fans voted no. Now it's against Australia Day, and polls show most of us are strongly for it. The Prime Minister today was himself again, once more, on the wrong side of this argument. Last week, Anthony Albanese was defending the Woolworths ban on Australia Day merchandise. Today, he was backing Cricket Australia's ban on Australia Day.
I think we need to stop looking for areas in which we can be outraged. We need to come together. Look, people will go to the cricket, people will celebrate, or for some people, for First Nations people, I respect the views that they have.
What hypocrisy. It's actually Cricket Australia that's stopping us from coming together and celebrating Australia by banning the celebration of Australia Day. And why doesn't this Prime Minister have the guts to say he's against Australia Day too, instead of trying to kill it quietly with 1,000 cuts? Now, don't buy the lie that the problem with the Australia Day is just the date, that these haters would celebrate Australia Day if it was just held on some other day, not the anniversary of the arrival of the first British settlers, actually convicts enjoying their white privilege. Because that's a lie. If these haters think Australia was built on an unforgivable crime, on a genocide even, that wiped out a wonderful Aboriginal culture that's lived on continuously since the Stone Age, then there is no day on the calendar where they would celebrate this nation. They're having you on. But as I said, this trashing of Australia is now a danger to our national security. It's true. We're just starting to see the signs. It is because a country that can't take pride in itself can't defend itself. And indeed, the Albanese government already complains it can't find enough soldiers willing to defend us, may now have to hire mercenaries from the Pacific. And don't forget, more Australian Muslims volunteered to fight for the Islamic State terrorists than volunteered for the Australian Defence Force that was fighting them. Meanwhile, this government has let in 540,000 migrants, 2% of our population, in just one single year. Just when 81 local councils are telling these newcomers, well, Australia's actually so shameful that they've gone and cancelled citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day. Now, when we rubbish Australia so thoroughly with such lies and exaggerations, like, this country we committed genocide. We even stole children from their parents just because they were Aborigines, when in fact the courts still can't find one such case. When we teach children these lies, when even preschool centres, like the SDM Bluebird Centre in Canberra, teach preschoolers the daily ritual of acknowledging that they're on land that was stolen, when all this goes on, who would ever defend this evil country in war? You imagine China, if it really does start this war that is threatening with Taiwan, and if we got dragged in, how are we going to ask the 1.2 million Australians of Chinese descent to choose Australia's side, the side of this supposedly racist and genocidal country. A warning there, because when the Liberals in government did stand up to the Chinese dictatorship's bullying, they got punished in seats with 1 in 5 Chinese voters or more. The anti-Liberal swing in those seats was twice the national average. And look right now, how this anti-Australia stuff is being thrown back in our face by radical imams, like this one at Australia's Sydney Al Madina Dawah Centre, saying we shouldn't support Israel or criticise the Hamas terrorists that attacked them.
Now we say to every individual who says about Hamas is terrorist, did you really forget your dark history? Did you really forget your ancestors, what they did to the native people in this country? How they killed them and how they killed their children? How they raped their women to change?
This is becoming very serious. Activists identifying as Aboriginal now make that very same dangerous link. Here is Larissa Baldwin-Roberts. She's the head of Get Up, which is our biggest left-wing activist group. She'll be celebrating Australia Day or Invasion Day like this.
For me, this year, obviously, what's happening to Palestinians will have a huge focus on Invasion Day. We lend our solidarity to our Indigenous brothers and sisters globally all the time.
Now, her ignorance is one thing. In fact, the Jews are Indigenous to most of Israel, including Jerusalem, not the Palestinians. But more frightening than that ignorance is Baldwin-Roberts' hatred for Australia, likening her fight against us to the Palestinians' fight against Israel, which she also falsely accuses of genocide. Where do you think that argument will take us? Oh, we should fight the Australian structure like the Palestinians fight Israel. Seriously? That is why I say this hatred of Australia, now preached by our giddy elites, is not just stupid. It's not just fed by lies. It's not just an insult to so many Australians. It is also very, very dangerous. But let me finish with another vision of our future, a different take on Australia, a different one to Cricket Australia's or our Prime Minister's. This is the chorus of an anthem by the legendary Lajamuna Teenage Band of Northern Territory. That's how it could be. That's how it should be. So I think it's time we learn to praise Australia again, or else. The Albanese government is now freaking. It faces a by-election in the Victorian seat of Dunkley in just over a month. Should be a cinch for the Labor Party, it's 6% margin. But there are people screaming out there about the cost of living. So Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called an emergency meeting in Canberra on Wednesday of all his MPs to talk about what to do.
What we'll be looking at, of course, is the advice that we've received about how we can take pressure off cost of living for people who are doing it tough without putting pressure on inflation.
Look, that's all very good, but didn't Albanese boast in the election campaign just a year and a half ago that he already had a plan to cut our cost of living?
What can you do to actually reduce the cost of lettuce and even on a day like Mother's Day, the cost of flowers, Mr Albanese?
Well, what you can do is have a plan to address cost of living issues. And that's why we've put forward practical plans, ones that'll make a difference for working families. Our plan, which consists of powering Australia for cheaper energy.
A plan for cheaper energy. Which wall did that hit? Joining me is the panel, Michael Kroger, former president of the Victorian Liberal Party, and David Hughes, head of the Menzies Research Centre. David, let me start with you. A summit of Labor MPs going to Canberra. That's going to cost nearly $500,000 in airfares and allowances, accommodation. Is it a good idea? The Prime Minister says, a lot of them would be there anyway, but this is just going to be 2 weeks before the return of Parliament anyway.
Well, yes, Andrew, our politicians spend a lot of time in Canberra as it is. Now, this is a difficult task. This is the most difficult of all tasks for governments to deal with cost of living pressures and inflation. And we saw detailed plans from Labor at the 2019 election, and they lost that election. The public was spooked. So at the last election, we didn't see a whole lot of detail. We saw promises that this would be cheaper and that would be cheaper. Now, the detailed solution here is very complex and very difficult to achieve. If you want to ease cost of living pressures but not increase inflation, there's very few levers that the Commonwealth government can pull. The main one, as Angus Taylor may have
but the government.
said earlier,
but I'm saying this bloke promised it. This bloke promised he had a plan a year and a half ago. It's gone nowhere. The energy prices, in fact, rocketed through the roof. And now it says, oh, look, in 2 weeks' time, he's going to have a rush meeting of his MPs to come think of something, Plan B. I mean, Michael, by the way, congratulations on your reports last week from Israel. I thought they were fantastic.
Thank you.
But what do you think of this?
Look, in 2016, Bill Shorten lied and almost won the unwinnable election, OK, over the Medicare. In 2019, he told the truth and lost. So in 2022, Albanese thought, bugger it, I'm just going to say whatever I need to say to get elected. I've got a plan for a cost of living. He had no plan, no detail. All he had, Andrew, was a few words from the advertising agency which said, say this over and over and over again. He also had the other thing he said was that he's implementing the voice in full. He regrets that too. So these things have caught up with him. He has no plan. He has no idea. He's not interested in economics. He's just like Whitlam in that regard. And now all the people in the Teal seats who voted for the Teal members and then voted for the voice, well, they're going to get clobbered on Wednesday.
Well, if the results of the last year and a half have been the results of his first plan, I'd hate to know what the second one looks like. But David, there are reports today. Yeah, it's funny. You know, he's very worried about the cost of living, but then the reports is going to overhaul the stage 3 tax cuts. But that he means people over 180,000, they're going to see their promised tax cut slashed by people, slashed by a few $1,000s. This is despite bracket creep. You know, making them pay more and more and more over the, 8 years since we last got a tax cut. Meanwhile, people under 180,000, they're going to get a little bit more. Now, the government isn't actually denying this, not explicitly. Smart move or not?
Well, where there's smoke, there's fire, and we've heard reports that Labor are looking to back away from these tax cuts for some time. Look, $180,000 is a lot of money, but if you're a family on a single income, you're often doing it tough, even on that income in our major capital cities. There's 600,000 people, over 600,000 people currently paying that top level of tax, and that's soon to rise to around 1 million people. This is all because of bracket creep, of course. We are a high-taxing country in Australia. I'm not sure people realise that. There's our analysis shows that there's around 118 countries over the world with lower headline rates of taxation, income taxation than Australia.
Yeah, but the thing is, Michael, Albanese desperately needs the money. He's spent like a drunken sailor. It seems he'd rather break a promise than, make spending cuts.
Well, a lot of those people in those Teal seats and Liberal seats are not voting for him. So he's thinking, I want to do whatever I can do to get re-elected. I mean, this bloke will say and do anything to get re-elected. That's the problem. And
but this is all this is in preparation for the Dunkley by-election, isn't it? That's the rush to get MPs.
That's why he's doing it now. Okay, that's why he's doing it now. Last week we were told that there was something coming in the May budget. We had to wait till then. But now this has come forward. Look. This guy never had a plan. He never had an idea. He's never produced the modelling for the $275 energy cut. Wouldn't you love to see that? Wouldn't you love that to be forensically analysed to say, well, that was a false promise you made. You had no justification for making that promise. Yeah, this is all about Dunkley. If he loses Dunkley, he's in trouble. They're obviously favourites, even though Liberals have picked up a great candidate in this fellow Nathan Conroy, who's a very popular mayor. But Labor will probably win that by-election. But yeah, that's why he's doing it, Andrew.
Well, I don't know. Look, it's we've got the big backflip from the Victorian opposition now. Of course, they're saying, well, before they said we're going to have we're going to back this treaty between the Victorian government and Aboriginal groups, a treaty that will involve things like land and resources and things like that. The opposition now says, maybe not. Here's the Nationals leader.
I've raised with the First Peoples Assembly, the previous First Peoples Assembly and the current First Peoples Assembly and their co-chairs, that we have major concerns, particularly around how cultural heritage is working or not working in Victoria, and we want to see those issues resolved before we move on to the next lot of discussions.
David, my problem with that is that if you're going to argue that with the ABC fully in favour of a treaty and things like that, you've got to do it with moral conviction. And you don't say we're doing it because there's problems with cultural heritage delays to big business. You know, people not, Aboriginal groups not turning up for 3 months at a trot, holding up a project. You say no to racism, no to treaties. Do you think the government, the opposition, has made a good move? Is it arguing it as it should?
Well, as you'll see by the backdrop, I'm in Sydney, so I'll leave these issues largely to Victorians to comment on. But I will say this. I think what Australians want and what Indigenous people want overwhelmingly is practical action over symbolism, and we saw that demonstrated through the Voice referendum. And I think a lot of these politicians would be wise to do what Tony Abbott did when he was Prime Minister and spend a significant amount of time in Indigenous communities, away from our capital cities, away from our Parliament, and let their decisions on these key issues be guided by those experiences.
Michael, argue it with more conviction, more moral passion, say it's a moral issue.
Well, say, stand on a principle, Andrew. I mean, the world is in a situation where people have got conviction. They want politicians that stand for something, who are going to risk their careers by taking firm stands. It's not a time for indecision. It's not a time for weakness, muddle-headedness. And, on this issue in particular, the Victorian opposition, I wish they would come out and simply say they are opposed to dividing the country by race forever. And a country cannot make, as John Howard said many years ago, you can't make a treaty with yourself. And so if you do implement a treaty or argue for a treaty, you're actually saying we are two Australias, we're not one Australia. Well, that was rejected in the Voices we saw, Andrew, overwhelmingly.
Absolutely. Big news this morning from America. Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, who was Donald Trump's big rival to be the Republicans' candidate in the US election in November. Campaign hit the wall. He's given up and is now endorsing Donald Trump. Here he is.
It's clear to me that a majority of Republican primary voters want to give Donald Trump another chance. They watch his presidency get stymied by relentless resistance, and they see Democrats using lawfare this day to attack him. Trump is superior to the current incumbent, Joe Biden. That is clear. I signed a pledge to support the Republican nominee, and I will honor that pledge. He has my endorsement because we can't go back to the old Republican guard of yesteryear, a repackaged form of warmed-over corporatism that Nikki Haley represents.
No, that just does leave that Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador to the US ambassador to the UN, as the only serious person that, but she's so far behind. This makes Donald Trump, Michael, almost unbeatable.
In the Republican primary, probably, and probably in the election, he looks like now he's favourite to win. But that's another example, Andrew. People didn't want a half-baked Trump or a half Trump or a third of Trump. They decided, I'll vote for the authentic thing. I'll actually vote for the real thing.
Passion and conviction will win you an election. Michael Kroger, Dave Hughes, thank you both so much for your time. Well, after the break, is this man the most expensive immigrant we have ever imported? And who on earth let him in? Plus, caught out, the government's excuse for bearing 45 helicopters rather than give them to Ukraine blows up. Now, we keep getting told that mass immigration is good for us. Bring them over, all these foreign workers, 540,000 people. More than 500,000 people the government let in last year, in 1 year. It even said, hey, let's bring in 860 Palestinian refugees too. Gave visas to these people living in areas controlled by terrorists, right? Gave them these visas so fast they could never have done proper security checks. But the problem here is, bring in the wrong people and this country could really get punished. Think of the Middle Eastern crime gangs that we've imported, the terrorism from a few of the refugees we've also imported. But I have never seen the costs of bringing in the wrong kind of refugee or immigrant summed up so confrontingly as Alan Howe did in The Australian on Saturday, counting the costs of Labor letting in Algerian extremist preacher Abdel Nasser Ben Brika, who stayed here after overstaying the visas he got in 1989. Benbrika was last month free from jail after serving 15 years for organising a terror cell and making plans to kill Australians at the MCG and other sporting venues. He says there's no danger now, of course. Lesson learned.
Just sleep. Don't worry about it. You have nothing to worry about from him now.
But have we learned our lesson? Joining me is Alan Howe, the Australian's History and Obituaries Editor. Alan Howe, thanks for joining me. First of all, who is this Benbrika and how was he allowed to stay?
Well, he's an Algerian citizen. I contacted the embassy of Algeria 2 weeks ago to find out whether he was still a citizen or at least qualified to be one, and they refused to answer that. What we know about him is an Algerian citizen who claims that he trained in aircraft maintenance, but seems to have avoided work in Australia. He came here on a tourist visa for 1 month in May 1989. He overstayed that. He then got an extension. He overstayed that, got another extension. This took him out to 6 months, overstayed that, and then was ruled to be here illegally. And we, on three occasions, we decided to deport him. And he appealed to the Immigration Appeals Tribunal. And somehow, in 1996, after years of contest, he was granted a visa to stay here permanently. By then he'd married and had a few kids, so that probably helped his case. It shouldn't, but it probably did.
Now, he went on then, luckily, with his new Australian permission to stay. He led a group of 17 people into these various plots, including a plot to blow up the MCG, etc., etc. Now, he was eventually detected, but let's go through the costs of all this. First of all, there was a massive police operation to find the evidence to put him before a court. How much did that cost?
Many millions of dollars. He was personally shadowed in visits to regional Victoria and southern New South Wales, where he tried out bombs, tested bombs, small ones, but bombs nonetheless. So that was 5,008 hours of police time. AFP, Victoria Police, and New South Wales Police. Then there were 97,480 phone calls that were intercepted. Now, the problem with these, Andrew, were that they spoke in a mix of English and Arabic. Now, in all, they recorded 16,000 hours of Benbrika and his gang talking. 16,000 hours is almost 2 years of tape recording. Now, let's assume that half it was in English and half might have been in Arabic. And of course, Arabic speakers like the Spanish and the Japanese speak very quickly, about 9,000 words an hour. So you can imagine the millions and millions and millions of words that needed to be transcribed and then translated. Now, it's cheaper today because it's automated. It wasn't then. And on average, it cost about 50 cents a word to get a translation done. I estimated that Benbrika's translations cost $36 million. I rounded it down to 30 just for safety's sake in the paper last weekend, but it's a considerable amount of money. And then there's the 24 gigabytes of information the Victoria Police gathered on him and his gang on the internet. Now, 1 gigabyte of information is 166 million words. That would take you about a year and a half to read. And I'm not saying they read every word of it. And of course, some of it might have been illustrative and taking up space. But nonetheless, it was a huge, huge, costly effort to track this bloke.
So at this stage, I think you've got the bill up to about 30 million by your estimation. People might challenge it, but it seems quite reasonable. Second, then, the cost of...
If they challenge it, then the figure will be going up, not down.
And I'd love to see the exercise too. You won't be challenged, believe me, Alan. Second, the cost of convicting him, how much would you cost that at?
Okay, Legal Aid spent more than $8 million on him. That's $2,005, Andrew. And they assigned a whole series of senior counsel and lesser junior lawyers. So that's $8.2 million, I think, was more than a quarter of their budget for that year. They had a $33 million budget, legal aid. Legal aid, of course, taxpayer money. So that's the beginning. That's just until the point of prosecution. The court case itself cost tens of millions of dollars. It's very hard to assess precisely how much, but rest assured the numbers are enormous. And then he was jailed. Well, jail in Victoria is the most expensive jail time in Australia. The Productivity Commission rates it at $154,000 a year. Now, I have only calculated Ben Breaker's cost. Ben Breaker had all his associates. And there are other costs that we can't assess. Ben Breaker was moved from one jail to another because he was seen to be teaching jihad, radicalising young other offenders in jail with him, so they moved him. Those are grenades that he's rolled into Australian society for later use. It's very hard to calculate the cost of this man. And then, of course, we must watch him around the clock, unlike any other Australian probably. And despite the cost, we must do. And that cost, as Cameron revealed in The Australian a decade ago at 2014 dollars, was $8 million a year. Now, that's about $10.4 million. But of course, it's also a more sophisticated job to do today because there are things like Instagram and there are other social media accounts, and we have to watch every single one of them and watch him. We can monitor his movements. That's become a bit cheaper because he's got a bracelet on. Let's hope he keeps it on.
Now, but Alan, not including the years that he spent on welfare while he produced 7 children here, not including the money we spent on educating those 7 children, not including any of that, how much do you think this one immigrant has cost because of Labor's stupid decision to let a chronic visa overstayer stay here?
Okay, well, look, he's 64 or thereabouts. We've never established his birth date. Maybe he doesn't know. But the actuarial life table says that he will live for 20 years and 3 months longer than today. So all up, he will cost taxpayers like you and me $200 million. And you know what? What really irks me is I can just imagine the smirk on his face on the day that he took the immigration pledge to become an Australian citizen. And I've got it here. It says, "I affirm my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I uphold and obey." And he was lying.
So basically, this was anything up to $250 million mistake. One guy, Alan Howe. I urge people to read your story in The Australian. It'll make you wonder who the hell's in charge of our gates. Thank you so much indeed.
Cheers, mate.
Now to another mystery. The Albanese government misled us last week, or maybe I should say lied, when it tried to explain the most stupid and incomprehensible decision it has made yet. I mean, this is so boneheaded and we need answers. The government decided last September to scrap all 45 of its Taipan helicopters after one crashed in July, killing 4 servicemen on board. In fact, it said it's going to strip them for parts and then bury them, literally bury them underground. And it's refusing to instead give them to Ukraine, which says it badly wants them to save injured soldiers from the battlefield in its war against Russian invaders. Now, nothing about this decision makes sense. One, the government says, oh, the helicopters are too unsafe. Well, the Ukrainians disagree. Other air forces disagree. We don't even know what caused that crash last year. And second, and here comes the deceit, the government says, well, the Ukrainians asked for these choppers far too late, asked for them in November.
That request came in just before Christmas, and our response is going through the normal process of being developed by the Department of Defence. I would make the point, again, that request came in 3 months after the disposal strategy began, 3 months after these aircraft were grounded, 3 months after maintenance ceased on these aircraft. The aircraft aren't in flying condition.
In fact, it was in the first week of October that Liberal Senator David Fawcett, himself a former test pilot and army officer, met a Ukrainian delegation at a security conference in Denmark. They told him they wanted these Taipans. Fawcett passed on the request, and on October 11, the Office of Defence Minister Richard Marles said they'd received it. That is a full month earlier than what you just heard from Pat Conroy, Minister for Defence Industries. Now, Senator Fawcett won't be interviewed. He's just trying to work with the government in the hope that it's not still too late to give Ukraine at least a dozen of the Taipans. He's not going to bag it publicly yet. But joining me is the man who broke this story, Kim Bergman. He's the editor of the Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. He also used to work in the defence industry. Kim, thank you so much for your time. How significant is this news that you broke?
I think it's extremely significant. It clearly completely undercuts the government's narrative that you outlined. I mean, David Fawcett is a very senior member of the opposition. As you say, he has a distinguished military career, and he assured me, in fact, we spoke again just a little earlier today, that the information about Ukraine's interest in the helicopters was indeed passed on to the government. And I'm sorry to correct you in terms of calendars, it wasn't 1 month before the official request went in, it was 2 months before. So you really have to wonder what on earth the government was doing. Yeah, what on earth the government was doing all of that time. But I'll go even further. Even if Senator Fawcett hadn't passed on the information, why couldn't the government themselves have made the decision on the 28th of September, when apparently Richard Marles took the decision to decommission and scrap the helicopters? I mean, everyone's heard of Ukraine. Are we trying to help them or not?
So here's the thing. The government says, oh, a 3-month delay since we made the decision to start disassembling them, maybe start burying them. And in those 3 months, it just got too hard. In fact, it had only been 1 month after that decision that they were contacted. Now, surely then there must be some Taipans that could have been sent without much trouble at all. I mean, Senator Fawcett thinks there still are some. Is he right?
I believe he is. That I also have independent sources, and they believe that even though many of the Taipans have been disassembled, it's not uniform in the level of disintegration that's occurred. And so there's a consensus that between 12 and 20 of them could return to flying condition. Now, I'll predict the government seems to be so desperate for reasons that aren't clear that no one is ever going to use these helicopters. I suspect that their next excuse will be something like, well, it's more complex because things have to be certified and there are airworthiness regulations. And what we have to keep in mind is the Ukrainians don't care about that. They're so desperate to get these helicopters to save dozens, maybe hundreds of lives, mainly of young people, every week. They've said, we'll look after that. Please just get the helicopters to us.
I simply don't understand that. The only thing that I can assume that may be the factor here, this government has gutted the army and the military generally in its defence review. There's so much money going to subs and a few other things that the army cannot afford to let these helicopters go if it has to pay $1 for the process. Is that what the issue is, that the army just doesn't have $1 and the government won't make good that money?
I think that's part of it. The situation with the Taipans has always been a little bit complex because even though they're quite safe helicopters, they've picked up a reputation in Australia for unreliability, and also they are very expensive to maintain. There's no doubt about that. And yes, Army certainly are cash-strapped, but when you think about it for a moment, even the cost of pulling them apart, which is not an easy exercise, they're big, complex machines with a lot of electronics, a lot of cabling, a lot of wiring. If you take into account the cost of doing that, for all we know, it would have been cheaper to ship them to Ukraine in the first place.
Kim Bergman, this is just such a scandal. We are letting in the lurch a country we pledged to help defend against naked aggression, against an alliance of tyrants, including Russia and China, and North Korea and Iran. just for sheer pig-headedness. No one can understand this decision. Thank you so much for bringing this to light, the deceit there. I appreciate that. I just staggered. After the break, the real reason Woolworths announced this controversial ban on Australia Day. Was it to hide how it is ripping off shoppers? Plus, expose the arrogant boast of the presenter who claims the ABC sacked her for racism. I think I've worked out why Woolworths went, hey, look at us, Australia. We are going to ban Australia Day merchandise. Now, I would have thought you'd, not make a big song and dance about it, but they wanted a distraction, I think, from the controversy about this alleged price gouging by Woolies and Coles. The government's looking into it. And a distraction that would get the Prime Minister back on their side, defending them against the opposition leaders' call for a boycott of Woolies, which the Prime Minister did again today. Backed Woolies. What about those poor Woolies jobs if there's a boycott?
Peter Dutton needs to explain why it is that he thinks those 200,000 jobs aren't important.
Now, the reason Woolies might have wanted that distraction and the support of the Prime Minister and the anti-Australia Day left is, look at this. It's the gross profit margin that Woolies put on food during the pandemic and after it, through the roof. Steady increase. And now compare the profit, the operating margin at Woolies, that's at the top in green. Then there's Coles, which is not as big, that's in red. And compare them both to British supermarkets Tesco and Sainsbury, which is half the profit margin charged by Woolies, which is really out of order. Woolies is making hay with food. And look, the hypocrisy of it. Woolies banning Australia Day merchandise because it says it's out of respect for its customers, which happen to be the customers it is ripping off with its prices for food. Joining me is the panel, Liberal MP Garth Hamilton and Steve Chavura, Senior Lecturer in History, Campion College and co-author of The Forgotten Menzies. Now, Garth Hamilton, Woolies, are they hypocrites or just being respectful of their customers?
Absolutely, they're not being respectful. They're being very disrespectful to the vast majority of Australians who look forward to Australia Day and like to celebrate it. The idea that, pushing this political agenda, and let's be very clear, that's what they're doing, not being respectful. They're pushing a political point of view, and you may well be right. It may be a distraction technique. But, why do they have this? Why do they have the power to be able to distract people like this? It's because of the duopoly that they're in. And that's only there because of policy settings from successive governments. Maybe it's time we had a look at that. Because if they're not going to do the right thing by the Australian people, and if they're going to use their weight to push political agendas, is that the right thing for the Australian people? I'm not sure it is.
Well, Stephen, the operating profit on sales of food, which is an essential, and the poor pay more of their income, a greater proportion of their income on food than do well-off people. That is more than twice the average of the big supermarket giants in Britain. Something seems a bit off there.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just sort of ordinary Australians who are feeling this. Probably most importantly, farmers are literally walking off the land because major supermarkets, including Woolworths, are so underpaying them that they just can't afford to operate anymore, at least according to the farmers and their representatives. And the last thing Australia needs is for our farmers to be walking off the land. So it's pretty hard to take Woolworths seriously with the idea that it's sort of got some great concern with the Australian public. But that's okay, because I got my Australia Day tie from Vinnie's and I got my Australia Day glasses from the Reject Shop.
Oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful, Steve. I don't know quite how you see through those sunnies, but there you go.
I won't drive in them.
Garth Hamilton, better not. To the race crisis at the ABC, there's a fascinating update here. The ABC is being sued by Antoinette Lattouf. Now, she identifies as a Lebanese Australian. She was dumped as a fill-in radio host over Christmas by the ABC for being an anti-Israel activist and posting on social media about this when she was told not to. But she blames racism. Here she is on the BBC.
There are people in that building who, and I would argue rightly so, provide far more inflammatory, sometimes in one case defamatory social media posts in which the public broadcaster paid for their legal case to defend this journalist. That journalist remains on air. The difference between them is they are white and I have an Arab background.
She was referring there to Louise Milligan, who the ABC outrageously did pay the legal expenses for when she defamed a Liberal MP and falsely accusing him of upskirting. But listen, Garth, the ABC sacking a poor little Arab girl. I mean, how likely is that? And by the way, was she actually assuming that her race gave her sort of protection? Because she's a couple of days before joining the ABC boasting that she couldn't be fired for pushing her opinions. Here she is.
For me, as an independent and freelance journalist, nobody can fire me. And so I will certainly be using my voice. If somebody doesn't want to work with me because I care about the dozens of journalists who've been slaughtered while doing their work, then honestly, them.
Well, Garth, a lot of ABC staff are backing her. Should they be?
Well, look, it's a pretty hard case for me really to get behind. Look, the ABC have made a real, fine art of tearing themselves apart. You're seeing viewership numbers fall. They're having to cancel programs. The problem for them is they view everything through the lens of racism. So everything they see must be racist,
yes.
Every single thing that happens. But look, I'll tell you what, let's assume, as the ABC would do if these accusations were made against a Conservative person, let's assume that all of these accusations are true, because this is part of a multiple set of accusations. Let's assume that all of these are true. This would put ABC as potentially the most racist organisation in the country. There's no other organisation is getting this constant stream of accusations of racism from former employees. Now that's if you apply the ABC's own standards. But look, it's got a whole whiff of the French Revolution, doesn't it? Just cutting off each other's heads, this great orgy of decrying each other, telling everyone's a racist, and wonder why no one's watching.
Well, it's because I think now the only people that now think that the scream of racism has any merit seem to be at the ABC, so the revolution is eating its own. But Steve Trevura, I mean, I fear that this is a moment of truth for the ABC, because it's got to call out this identity politics bull that it's done so much to encourage, because if it doesn't, and if it caves, I fear that you'll have an ABC where people of colour will feel that they're entitled to use it as a platform to do whatever they like, and the ABC will be too scared to sack them, and it'll go even more to the identity politics left than it is already.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And look, I'm a great proponent of freedom of speech, but the public service in Australia and the ABC in particular, they do have rules to ensure that the public have faith in the services that they fund. And the ABC in particular has a rule for its employees, a social media rule, which says you cannot post social media comments that are likely to undermine the public's trust in the objectivity of the ABC. Ms. Lattouf has posted several things on Israel and Palestine from a very biased perspective, and that is a very emotive issue in Australia right now. She's fallen foul of those rules. Now, her claim is that others have fallen foul of them, but they haven't been so punished. I don't think racism has anything to do with it. To be honest, I think what's happened is that Ms. Lattouf just isn't that important at the ABC, and they've decided to make an example of her. Now, if Ms. Lattouf and other journalists actually want to see the ABC sort of loosed from these public service gags on free speech, then they might consider advocating for the privatisation of the ABC.
Well, I think that the reason they're being caught out is that the ABC has been exposed as hiring only people of the left. And if they allowed free speech to the left, they should allow free speech to the right to hide that fact. And that's what they do not want to do. They don't have a single Conservative host on their shows. Garth Hamilton, Stephen Trevura, thank you both so much for your time. Garth, I'm going to come back to you next week about a story about NAB hypocrisy that I know you wanted to raise. We'll do that next week when we've got more time. After the break, Britain's toughest headmaster sued for banning Muslim prayers at a multicultural school. Wait until you learn why. Plus, Prince Harry accepts a trash award. How desperate is this man? You know, with mass immigration and with some communities in particular, we are seeing a change. Immigration has become colonisation. And I thought the left was against colonisation. I thought the left was against the displacement of the indigenous people of Britain. I'll give you an example from Britain. Catherine Birbal-Singh, she's famous as the strictest principal in Britain. She's someone who achieved spectacular success with her students, who are mainly from immigrant or minority families. She's actually now being sued for banning Muslim prayers at her inner London school. But she said she had no choice but to do this if she wanted to save it from radical Islam and let children there feel that they all belonged.
Our lovely school turned into one that was really quite horrible, where some of the more committed Muslims, as it were intimidating the Muslims who were eating and going by the break hall food stand and stopping them from eating, or intimidating them into praying. Or we noticed one girl, for instance, who never wore a hijab before, who was suddenly wearing one. So the culture of the place changed very quickly, within days, from being this lovely, happy place into one which was quite aggressive and intimidating.
See, this is not just at this school. There's another school too, which tried to control Muslim fundamentalism and its playground in its school. And there's a whole protest outside. There's flags, Palestinian flags right outside, intimidating students. Now, this is, in fact, an issue throughout Europe now. Immigration becoming colonisation. When my parents migrated, when you left because there was no internet. Letters were too expensive. You had to write on one sheet of paper, those blue aerograms. You didn't hear TV. You couldn't, if you didn't integrate into the country, you couldn't get work. You had to speak the language. With mass immigration now, it has become much, much more difficult to insist on integration or assimilation, because right now you can have free, cheap trips to back home. You can talk to your family for nothing through the internet. You can have YouTube telling you what's going on. You can go to sleep at night hearing the news from back home. You don't have to speak the language either. You go to parts of Melbourne, to Chinese parts, you go to parts of Sydney. Muslim suburbs, you can find a lot of shops that will talk your language, Arabic or Chinese or whatever. You don't necessarily need much English. So there is a real problem here, a real problem, particularly now with radical Islam. That seems to be very insistent. Joining me is Esther Krakue, writer, broadcaster, author, all sorts of things. Esther Krakue, there have been 2 days of hearings into this case last week, and we're now waiting for the judgment. Now, Birbal-Singh is being sued by a Muslim student who says the ban on praying made her feel guilty and unhappy. Your opinion about that ban?
Well, the thing is, there are two reasons for the ban. One is practical reasons. There's just literally no space to have a prayer room. And because when they did allow kids to pray in the courtyard, that some of them actually bullied other students that weren't praying. And there's obviously the ideological reasons. The school is a secular school, and parents know this before they enroll their child in the school. At the end of the day, this case highlights the limits of multiculturalism in Britain, which is the fact that you actually have to sacrifice certain things for community cohesion. And you cannot keep accommodating to people that feel like they're above the community. I mean, this school has GCSE Sunday lessons, which obviously discriminates against Christian students that can't go to church. You know, Jehovah's Witness students have to study books that are against their belief. And this is the same thing. There is no discrimination going on here because all students are held to the same standards. And I think in Britain, we haven't asserted that we actually have to have certain values that allow for us to have social cohesion. And one of those values is you're British first and everything else second. And apparently some people feel like they're above that.
Esther Krakue, I'm so sorry that the audio issues stopped us a bit having more of you as we wish every week. Talk to you again next week. Thank you so much for your time. That's it from me. Sharry Markson is next. Good night.